views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Coming up on this edition of Perspectives, former Assembly member Michael Blake joins us on the show discussing his political forecast for the year 2022. Plus, he weighs in on the January 6th riot investigation, the push for voting rights change, and a whole lot more. That's up next with Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime, and we're glad to have you. We're in the year 2022, just getting started, and a whole lot happening. So we're glad that you can share with us here on Perspectives as we celebrate more than 20 years of bringing you news, information, and current events right here to the borough of the Bronx and New York City. So glad to have you sharing with us today on the show. As always, you can stay connected to us on our social media platforms, BronxNet TV. And then if you're looking to reach me personally, it is DC Jaime 23 on both Instagram as well as Twitter. And then my Facebook page, the professional page, is Daren C. Jaime. There you can tune in, find out some information as well as some inspiration. Well, coming up on today's show, we want to go front and center talking about the topic of politics. We have a very special guest, no stranger to the show here, but certainly a credible voice for such a time as this. Served as the Assembly member for 2014 to 2020 in the New York State Assembly, representing the 79th Assembly District in the Bronx. He's also served as the vice chair of the at-large, of the Democratic National Committee from the years 2017 to 2021, also being the first black man elected to DNC leadership since 1996, where he led efforts to mobilize millennials as well as communities of color and local elected candidates. He joins me now as the founder and CEO of Atlas Strategy Group Incorporated, which focuses on economic empowerment, social justice, and civic engagement for communities of color. We're joined by none other than Michael Blake. And Mike, glad to have you on the show. And as we said, a lot to talk about. And I want to go first and invite you to talk a little bit about the January 6th investigation. As we talk about the January 6th investigation into the insurrection, justice is being served in some forms, but in the hearts and minds of many people across America, there's a lot of injustice being involved.
Of course, Daren, great to be with you, and Happy New Year to you and yours and to everyone watching. When we think about January 6th, I think we got to make it very clear. There were some that were focused on preparing for an inauguration, while many on the other side were preparing for an insurrection. And the appreciation of why you should be concerned. When you think about what's happening in other countries around the world, where pure dictatorships and autocratic measures are happening, of saying very clearly that they're putting in place efforts so that your voice is not heard. When you have information now coming out that the former president was actually moving forward and investigating and having an executive order to seize ballot boxes after the 2020 election, you should be absolutely terrified about the direction of what's happening on the Republican side and those that are silent about this. When you see and realize that you have Kevin McCarthy and others in Republican leadership saying they will not testify. I don't know about you, but I don't know of anyone who's afraid to testify unless they have committed a crime or are aware of one, if not both. And then most recently, the new Republican Attorney General in Virginia fired the top lawyer from University of Virginia after that lawyer had taken a leave to serve on the January 6th committee itself and provide support in that manner. So just realize this when we break this all down. You have a former president who was trying to steal ballot boxes. You have Republicans in leadership that are trying to steal credibility and your voice. And you have lawyers that are literally trying to take away people's jobs for them speaking out and telling the truth. If you do not think that democracy is at stake and on the ballot, we don't know what else to say to you. Don't just talk about civil rights from the 50s and 60s. Talk about your voting rights and civil rights now.
When we talk about voting rights and civil rights, we'll get to that in just a few moments. But it seems as though when we look at what's going on, there's been a great sweep, particularly amongst Senate Republicans, as well as Senate Republicans, congressional Republicans, in really trying to dismiss the gravity of what happened on that fateful day. Capitol police members lost their lives. People were injured. And most of all, our elected officials in this country were under siege. And it seems as though if we're not paying any attention to this, if this isn't an assault on our democracy, I don't know whatever we can deem as an assault on democracy.
Well, not only is it an assault on democracy, Daren, this is an assault on your credibility and your eyes and what you're telling and everyone's telling you. So let's break this all down. There's not a question on if Republicans and Democrats were not under serious, legitimate threat for their lives as it was happening. This is a broader conversation. Their fear of Trump is greater than their love of the country. They are afraid of losing primaries. They're afraid of what would happen within their elections. They are more afraid of losing an election than people losing their lives. And that's why what's going on in 2022, whether it be federally, of course, here in New York, as we prepare for what's happening within New York primaries and the general election as well, it's that understanding of the urgency of the moment of what's happening right now. And so to everyone that's paying attention and watching us, whether it be a Bronx election, whether it be a statewide election, whether it be a federal election itself, we have to realize that at the end of the day, the Republican Party right now is a party that cares about destroying democracy rather than protecting it.
And when we talk about protecting democracy, one of those things that we hold very true to is voting rights. And we know that Martin Luther King, John Lewis, all others who really fought that March on Washington took place to really talk about voting rights, civil rights, and making sure that everybody was ensured the right to vote. When we look at the year 2022, it doesn't seem like much has changed. As a matter of fact, we've got states putting in protections, talking about protections, so if you will, for election day and elections. And these are Republican states, and we know that. When we look at what's happening right now and we see the challenge that's going on, many people could say, while we take steps forward, we've elected an African-American president who's now out of office. We could also look back and say, we've seen a lot of, going back, a regression when we look at the Voting Rights Act and where we are today.
Well, we're certainly watching it happen in real time. But now this is about the consistent, continual question as well, that it's not just Republicans that are blocking it, it's Democrats. And we think about what's at stake, whether it be Kyrsten Sinema, whether it be Joe Manchin. It doesn't matter about just you being a Democrat. You have to be the right Democrat that's protecting us in the right ways. And so it is the responsibility that we have in this moment to defend democracy, regardless of the party affiliation of who's blocking it. And we have this urgency that is existing, that this is hard for us to appreciate in this moment, but there may not be, fire hoses, may not be dogs, may not be bullets as it was in the 50s and 60s. But the level of the crisis is just as great right now because they were fighting so hard to give us the right. But now you have people that are comfortable blocking it. And so at the end of the day, Daren, I think we have to go a bit deeper and realize that if there is someone that will not vote to give you a chance to have better chance to vote, then that is someone who should not be representing you.
Let me take a quick break and come back and pick it up after this, talking about President Biden and his administration. How challenging is it that the fact that we cannot get the voting rights passed, given the fact that President Biden and his administration made this a mark in their campaign. We'll talk about that when we return right here on Perspectives.
When taking public transportation, don't touch your phone. Carry hand sanitizer and use it immediately upon leaving the bus or train. Avoid touching your face. If someone is coughing or sneezing, move away. Wash your hands with soap and water as soon as possible. Limit contact with poles. If possible, avoid rush hour. Don't eat or drink on public transportation. Keep your bag off the floor or other surfaces. Avoid directly touching turnstiles. Stay up to date with the latest from your local health department and CDC.
And we're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you as we are continuing our conversation with Michael Blake, who is giving us some political forecast into the year 2022. Mike, as we are here right now in 2022, we talked about right before we went to break about the voting rights, the fact that the possibility of rule changes. But you have on one side people who want to say rule changes. On the other side, you have people who are talking about rights being infringed. Please give us the balance, if you will, about how you determine rule changes versus rights.
Well, let's understand first and foremost, a lot of the rules that were established in a scenario where Black and brown people didn't have the chance to vote, didn't have the chance and opportunity to have our rights protected in the first place. So it's always kind of surreal to me when I'm listening to people tell us about the protection of democracy when you have Constitution and other elements that were written where Black folk didn't have a chance to be a part of that democracy. So when we're in a zone now where we are actually discussing changes to a filibuster, which has had changes many times in our history, even recently, whether it be for financial recovery and stimulus, whether it be to proceed with Supreme Court judges and others move forward with the process. It's hypocritical and nonsensical when I'm listening to someone say in a cinema, in a mansion and others, well, we can't change the rules because of what's happening here. You change the rules so that people can vote. And then when we listen to Manchin saying, well, we'll trust that everything will fine, we'll protect you when it comes to any challenges that happen to your voting rights. Well, we've seen this example over and over again of why we've had to step in, because the courts did not protect us. So we're not talking about 1862. We're not talking about 1962. We're not talking about 1922. We're talking about in 2022 that there are Democrats and Republicans that are blocking our chance to have your rights protected to vote. And so simply put, as we wait to see what's happening here, when people ask, what are some next steps? Number one, I think obviously they have to move forward in pressing and having everyone actually state on the floor, where do they stand? Are you a yay or a nay in terms of changing the filibuster for people to be able to vote? But also locally, we have to be attentive about voting rights here in New York. There have to be reforms to the New York City Board of Elections. There have to be changes around petitioning. It doesn't make sense that you would have people, as a global pandemic is happening, to have the same level of signatures you have to collect to get on the ballot. There have to be protections when it comes to affidavit ballots, that if you demonstrate that you are able to vote and you should have the right to vote, just because you don't fill out one section B and section B, your vote should not be blocked. It should be easier to vote, not harder. And whether it be from the state house to the U.S. House, whether it be to the state Senate or the U.S. Senate, there has to be protections in place. And again, if you are a real Democrat, then you should be standing up and making sure we should vote. And if you're not, you need to be primaried and removed from office.
Let's talk about this for a minute. As you talk about Democrats, we have a presidential candidate that is Democratic, of course, and his administration really spoke about voting rights. However, when we look at the Martin Luther King holiday, a lot of people gave the Biden administration some strong criticism, saying that it has taken you this long to pass voting rights. And we know that this is something that you spoke about, something that you advocated for, but yet and still can't get it across the finish line. How much does this besmirch, if you will, the record of Joe Biden going forward? Because we do understand that midterm elections are around the corner, and this can be very crucial when it comes to communities of color and actually making the way for Democrats to be able to win if this voting rights is not passed.
Let's be clear, it's a problem, right? We can't even try to ignore it. When you look at, has there been incredible progress in this country? Absolutely, under Joe Biden. There's no question about that. Financial progress, what's happened around COVID vaccinations, what's been happening in terms of restoring our economy. There's been incredible progress. However, you can't ignore that when it comes to voting rights and when it comes to criminal justice, two elements that should impact all Americans, not just Black Americans. But let's be clear, as Black folk, we care about this immensely. We should not be in a scenario where we're still trying to figure out, why can't we get this done? And so the responsibility is this: if you care about on healthcare, on housing, on criminal justice, on environmental justice, on all the things that we care about for our communities, unless democracy is protected, to me, there is nothing more important and more urgent for the sake of everything else than saying we must get voting rights passed and we have to make sure that this bill is actually signed into law. You can't really move forward with other elements if you don't have a democracy. And so to me, it definitely has a black mark. We can't ignore that reality. But now is the urgency of saying, make people say on the floor, are you with voting or not?
Let's take a quick break and come back and talk a little bit about what more must be done in order to get this passed and moving forward. Michael Blake, our guest here on Perspective. Stay with us. We'll be right back in a few. Back here on Perspectives, Daren Jaime here with you, and we are glad to have you with us. As always, you can watch us here every week on Perspectives, bringing you news, information, current events, and the things that you want to hear. We've got some very interesting guests and some very interesting topics in the year 2022. Glad to be giving you this show for more than 20 years now, and we continue going forward with the news that matters. I bring Mike Blake back in. And Michael, as we were talking before the break, talking about voting rights, you hammered down and drilled down specifically in New York, talking about amending and seeing some changes in voting rights. One of those changes that are being proposed right now is allowing independent voters to have the right to vote in a primary. Some are for, some are against. What's your take?
I don't believe an independent should be able to vote in a primary unless you are registering for that particular party. And if you want to make a change later on, then it's a different course of action, because then you're essentially creating it to be a little bit too fluid in the impact of the process. I think if someone's making a decision to align with a party, especially given where we're at in the country now, things might have been different before, but given what's going on in the country now, that's where I stand in that regard. But I think equally, there should be more time for early voting. There should be no excuse absentee voting, period, full stop. You have to have protections for affidavit ballots. We saw it repeatedly here in New York, in particular in the Bronx. There were more than 1,100 individual residents who had their ballots not counted, overwhelmingly because they didn't fill out section Part B on the affidavit ballot, which is simply asking you why you voting by affidavit ballot, which many people may not know. But when we think about what's happening here and the crisis of the moment, whether it be the 17 lives that were lost in the Bronx fire, which we still need to realize, stop blaming victims for having a door open and more so focus on landlord accountability and holding landlords accountable. When we think about what's happening around criminal justice, and whether it be an 11-month-old baby or officers who had their lives that were lost due to gun violence, when we think about why we still are battling COVID inequities, all these things are reasons for us to understand the urgency as it relates to democracy. Because at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, who is voting for you in these legislatures? And if that person's not with you and willing to do the difficult things that are right, then they shouldn't be representing you. And so democracy is intertwined with policy. And the same fear and anger and frustration that we have as it relates to COVID, as it relates to criminal justice, as it relates to what's going on at Rikers, as it relates to jobs, as it relates to schools, is all intertwined by the people that are put in place for the policies that they put in place. And so at the end of the day, Daren, I see this in a moment that, yes, when we think about primaries, it has to be about who are you willing to say embodies my values for our party. And the reason why I think it's important is sometimes obviously I'm a proud Democrat, but you look on the other side, I want for Republicans to truly state clearly, where do you stand? Do you stand with individuals that supported the insurrection? Do you stand with individuals that would not want to certify an election? Do you stand with individuals who still want to talk about vaccines are ridiculous? Do you want to stand with individuals that don't believe in COVID protections? Do you want to stand with individuals that are trying to confuse you about critical race theory? Do you want to stand with individuals that stand with insurrectionists? And so at the end of the day, that's why I think it's important to align with your party in a party primary, because you should have to be very clear and accountable that you believe in that party, but then equally you believe in those individuals when you're making that decision.
Keep it right there in New York State, talking about the affidavit ballot. We know that a lot of people 1,100 people had their votes actually discarded simply because they didn't fill out one element of the box. But can we actually forecast and predict, given the fact that we're still in this COVID pandemic, we're still navigating these waters, there is going to be a rise of people who say, listen, I may not necessarily want to come to the ballot box come November or, come time to go to vote, simply because of safety and wanting, for personal reasons. So I think on one side, we're going to see a rise of people, and you can tell me if you agree, using affidavit ballots, using that absentee vote, and we need to be prepared for it.
We need to be prepared that for 3+ years we weren't prepared. And that when you have variants that are happening, if you're telling people that they can remote work and they can have remote school and they can figure out all these other changes, then you should be changing to make it easier for people to have the right to vote. And you should be making it fairer to protect them when they show up to vote. At the core aspect of this, and when we think about democracy, I didn't have people as our ancestors lose their lives for us to have a chance to vote, to have people that are making it harder for others to vote because they want to protect themselves and get reelected. And so for jobs, for justice, for housing and for healthcare, for doing what's right for our people, It is the understanding that in 2022, the battle has to be the soul of the nation, the soul of New York, and that comes down to protecting democracy.
When we talk about protecting democracy, obviously, we've got a lot on the table. We've got only about a minute left for you, but give me some things that we should be paying attention to over the next quarter.
We should be paying attention to the state budget that Governor Hochul and Lieutenant Governor Benjamin have now presented for New York State, and the opportunity of, I think, $216 billion and what they've laid out, what that vision can be between now and April 1st, when the fiscal year begins here in New York. We need to be focused on Tish James, our Attorney General, and the continual progress she's making around holding former President Trump accountable and what's happening in that case. We need to make sure we're providing protections to Alvin Bragg, who's trying to do the right thing to make sure that our voices are being heard when it comes to criminal justice, what's happening here. And last but not least, we need to be elevating the opportunity for more people to get in the game as it comes to redistricting. We're waiting for redistricting to be finalized here in New York. What happens with those lines to make sure that you're represented. So people, please pay attention. Things are not resolved. Things are not settled. Things will move quickly. But just in the same way that we believed in you for the last 3 years, we're going to certainly believe in you for the next 5 months as it relates to these primaries and beyond. And it's our job to stand with you and support you in every possible way.
Michael Blake, our guest, thank you so much for being with us here on Perspectives. We have to wrap it and leave it there, but I want to bring you back next month so that way we can take another look and see where we are and what progress is made or what kind of regression we've made. Michael, thanks so much for being with us.
Always appreciate you, Daren. Thank you.
All right, brother. All right. Well, listen, that about wraps it up for this edition of Perspectives. As we can always tell you, we never tell you who to vote for, but it's important that we exercise our right to vote. As voting rights are being challenged, it's important for people not to be on the sidelines, but really to be involved. Not just involved, but engaged. Pushing elected officials, motivating other people to get to the polls, to get ready to vote. Our democracy is definitely under assault. And whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you definitely deserve that right to vote. And so we want to make sure that we're spreading the message here about voting rights and encouraging people to make sure to exercise their right. It's a right that so many people died for, and we are living the benefits thereof. So let's exercise our right. Let's fight for voting rights, and let's make sure that everybody's voice can be heard. That's why we have this show called Perspectives. I'm Daren Jaime. That's my perspective, and we encourage you to stay connected to Perspectives. And listen, share your perspective. You just don't know. It might make a difference in somebody else's life. Take care.
Because it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.